Welcome back. In this video tutorial, I'm going to give you a mixing checklist. That's going to be a list of some guidelines for mixing your instruments. Keep in mind that these are just general guidelines for conventional pop and rock. Other genres are going to have some different traditions. Let's start with our drums. The kick drum first. Is the attack audible? Does the body give you enough power? Or does it pop out of the mix too much, making your meters peak every time you hear it? Usually the kick will make meters jump, but if it's too much, it might be taking the spotlight from other instruments. They're all going to need to be quieter in order to keep the overall mix from being too loud. The snare drum. Does it provide enough of a backbeat and body to prevent it from sounding tinny, with enough top-end crack to balance out the rest of the sound? If it or the reverb is too loud, it'll sound kind of 80s. Mixing the snare too loud is something that new music engineers tend to do. You need to be able to hear it, but just set it loud enough so that it doesn't step on other sounds. Keep the snare limited to its function, keep in the beat. That's what the snare does. You need to hear it, but you don't need a metronome, right? Now let's talk about the hi-hat. This is a cymbal. We gauge the hi-hat in terms of its brightness. Is it bright enough or too high? Because the fundamental frequency of the hi-hat is so high, it usually cuts through a mix even at a low level. Make sure it's not too loud or you'll end up cranking your other faders, and before you know it, your whole mix will be too loud. Remember, the function of the hi-hat is to give your music a pulse. Now let's talk about the toms. Toms should be assertive, but when they come in, they shouldn't blow away the other sounds. The crash cymbal. Crashes only need to be somewhat audible to be effective. You don't want them blasting out of the mix, or they'll obliterate everything else. The ride cymbal. The ride is similar to the hi-hat. You need to make sure it's just bright enough and audible. It's got a lower frequency than the hi-hat, however, but all you want to hear is its ping. If you hear too much of the lower stuff, it's probably too loud. Now let's take a look at some of our other instruments. The bass. The bass gives us a solid foundation so the work doesn't sound thin or top-heavy. You should be able to hear the individual note pitches. If they're indistinguishable, you might need to bring up the low mids and dampen the lows a little bit. You should also be able to distinguish the bass from the kick drum. Guitar. There's a few types of guitar sounds and functions, so we'll talk about them one at a time. A clean electric guitar needs to be audible, bright, and crisp, but usually it's part of the background unless it's doing a solo. Make sure any high frequencies aren't taking away from the vocals. You can adjust levels or pan so that they don't conflict with the vocals. Acoustic guitars need bright highs without being twangy, and enough body so that they're not tinny. But with too much body, it gets muddy, so watch your EQ here. Rhythm guitar is often pretty loud and aggressive. Make sure the bottom end is not too wimpy and doesn't get muddied up with the bass and the kick. Make sure the high frequencies aren't buzzy or annoying. If you want the rhythm up front, make sure it's panned away from your vocals. Lead guitar should be at the same level as a vocal. The vocal should sound like it's handing off to the lead guitar. Now let's talk about keyboards. You want to hear the notes without their overpowering other instruments. Keyboards bring in good low mids and mids, so make sure they get enough airtime in those frequency bands, but make sure they're not muddy in the low half. Background vocals. These sound best in the background. High harmonies pop out more than low ones, so you might need to reduce these a little more. The background vocals need to be crisp, but they don't need too many low mids as long as they don't sound tinny. The lead vocals will fill in the lower ends of the frequency spectrum. Lead vocals. This is usually the most important part of your song. You need to be able to hear all of the words. Lead vocals should be crisp without any hissing or spitting. These are the highs in the frequency bands. There needs to be enough body so the sound is warm but not thin. Listen at different volume levels on different systems. If you find that the vocals are popping out 1 minute and then kind of buried or backward the next, it might be undercompressed. Try running the vocal through your compressor at a low ratio like 2:1. And of course, take your time mixing the lead vocal because it's very important to your song. Give your ears a break for a few days and come back again later to listen again. This concludes our tutorial about the mixing checklist.